Going to be a big class this year for the Dirt Modified Hall of Fame. What a class they have this year. Three-time series titleist Tim Fuller, Danny O'Brien, Bob Cameron, Glenn Heineman, of course, Paul Kuhl, who used to be at Flemington Speedway, Patrick Donnelly. Anybody, if you watched This Week on Dirt, you saw his work. Lori Fallis, we're going to talk to her tomorrow. But the other guy that I didn't mention, they list him as mechanic and partner at Bicknell Racing Products, but actually Randy Williamson is a heck of a lot more than that. The 63-year-old, I've been with him at the races, and if you guys have too, he lives off his cell phone. The advice he has given to teams over the years is just, what's that old commercial? Priceless is what it is, and that's what Randy Williamson is. So let's head up to St. Catharines, Ontario. 63-year-old Randy Williamson. He's a year older than me. How we doing, man?
Yeah, I'm good, Dougie. Very good.
So what was your reaction when you heard about this?
Very surprised. Buffy Swanson had called me at the shop one day and said that they were looking at inducting me into the Hall of Fame, which I thought was very, very cool. I've been fortunate to watch a lot of great race car drivers and people that are in the sport that have been doing this. And like I said, I'm very, very appreciative to be in there.
And especially with the people you're going in with, right?
Yes, good friends. It's funny because even like Glenn Heineman, I was always very close with Glenn, back and forth with Doug Olson through the days and back and forth. And then recently, the last 4 years, 5 years, he's been buying cars from us. Of course, Timmy Fuller and Danny O'Brien, both those boys from Can-Am, Brockville area.
Yep.
Very, very fortunate. So, and Pat Donnelly, like I said,
yeah.
I talked about Pat before, going back to Wheat Sport days, bringing cases of beer down there.
Yeah, ask him about that story, too, because he used to bring Molson Brodeur down. And anybody who was our age in the States, Molson Brodeur was pretty much, I think, the only reason we went to Canada, to be quite honest with you, was to get Molson Brodeur. So when did it all start for you? When you told me you were a teenager?
Yeah, well, my next-door neighbor was a stock car driver, Terry St. Juan, and long story short, I hung around with his younger brother. And they were on one side, and then the opposite side was a friend of ours that we would just hitchhike. The three of us would hitchhike to the racetrack, which is at Maryville was about probably a 10-mile hitchhike.
Okay.
And we'd get rides there usually, and then on the way home, of course, it's late at night. Don't want to really walk on the roads, but just hung around the pits, and I got to meet up with Pete Bicknell, my partner. And at the time, he said, "Hey, if you guys want to ride back home, we'll give you a ride back home," because he lives in the same neighborhood.
Oh,
and
okay.
Back then, he had a ramp truck. And he said, "Well, if you want to ride," he says, "you got to ride in the stock cars." Well, we didn't mind that. So three of us, back then, the late models back in the day, it was pretty well like an open cabin in there. And so we all jumped in the back of the in the race car on the back of the flatbed. And it was actually the ramp truck back then. We got to ride home.
Nice.
And
Did you ever
that's
think
how it started.
you'd be working with Pete at some point? Because he was, I think 5 years old, you said, something like that?
Yeah, he's 5 years older. Well, see, I was going to school at that time, and what he had said was, like, if we weren't doing anything, maybe he had a shop probably about 15 miles away from where we were, like where we lived. And he said, if you want to stop by the shop, just hang around and I'll give you something to do. So when we first went there, the three of us would drive our bikes down through the city and get there, and then we'd sweep floors or paint the crash guards or whatever we could do to help out.
You never wanted to drive yourself?
No, not really. I mean, we did a lot of go-kart racing, which is now bench racing anymore, but did a lot of that stuff. We'd all go to the go-kart track and have 10 of us to go out there and beat and bang on each other out in the go-kart track. And but no, with me helping Pete out, I really didn't financially have the money to do it either. But never really had a drive to be a race car driver now.
Then you tell me Pete let you take out one of his modifieds for a heat or something one time?
Yep. Yeah, I did have opportunity a few times. Like I ran what they called the mod stock back then and a pro stock for a couple different people, just at the back of the field and just kind of got my feet wet. Didn't want to wreck the cars up, and Pete let me drive his modified one time at the tail end of a heat race. And back then we were having a hard time with car count. Pete had two cars, so he says, "Well, we might as well just let you drive the car in the heat race and then go and start and park." So I would just go run the heat race and then go out and start and park.
And you told me really you enjoyed the mechanical side of it more than the actual driving.
I do. I love watching race cars and trying to make them go faster. It's just always been something that I've always wanted to do, and since I was young. And you sit there and just study the race car and try and figure out where the problem is with it, and trying to mechanically figure out what to do to fix it.
And then would you and Pete actually built a race car together? Was that like the first car that Pete built, or was it the first car you built?
Well, back in the mid 70s, it would have been 75, 77 area. It would have been about 75. We built the car in Pete's mom's garage, and long story short, a friend of ours, Merv Winfield, he came through the door, and I really didn't know Merv too much, but Pete did. And long story short, Merv comes through the door, and Pete says to me, he says, "I got some good news and bad news." And I says, "Well, please." He says, "The bad news is I just sold the car," but he said, "The good news is I'll give you $1,000 to help me build another one." So back then, being a high school kid, and at the time I was probably tying
in the 70s. Really?
Oh yeah. Well, I was probably tying grapes to go down to any NASCAR race that I was going down to see or anything like that, or even going to the racetrack. That's how I was making my money, just tying grapes in the grapevines. So.
What do you mean? I don't understand what you mean.
The graperies up here, which is all the wine industry.
Oh, you were literally tying grapes. I thought you were.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Tying grapes, tying grapes in the grapevine. That's how, you used to make, I think, $2 an hour, and
wow.
Go and tie grapes to save money up to go to the racetrack next year.
So $1,000 for helping Pete build another race car. That was a quick decision on your part, I'm sure.
That was good money back then.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's still not bad today, depending on what.
Yeah.
So what were those early cars like?
Oh, they were all like leaf spring cars, drop axles. They were Econoline Ford drop axles, but it was more wrecking yard stuff. Like we used to have the Buick hubs, and we had a fellow around our area that did all the machining of the hubs for us, and we did have quick change rears back then.
You did,
but
okay.
It was all four bolt bolt-on spindles back in the day, kind of hanger-heim suspension on torsion. We did have leaf spring cars, and I can remember building half leaf cars for the front end of the car, of which we tried them for probably about 5 races and gave up on them and put a coil spring on the front.
When did it become like Bicknell Racing product? When that became like the main thing? Because you said there were a few years in there where we did some other things before we got a little more serious.
Yeah, well, the mid 70s, like 75, 76, we were building probably about 3 cars a year, one for Pete and then a couple for different people like Merv Winfield. And then it was 77. Pete and Nancy started Pure Bicknell Automotive, which was the garage, and the race car building business kind of took a little bit of a hiatus. We built a few, but not very many. And it wasn't until around 79, 80 area where we started to do more building of the cars. Probably we're building about 20 a year. And then I was explaining there earlier on, we got hooked up with auto finishers out of Syracuse, New York, with Mike Sweeney and Jim Beachy. And they started selling more and more cars of ours back then. That was in the 85 it would have been, 84, 85 area. And built some cars for people like Randy Glensky, Mitch Gibbs, and guys like that back in the day. And like I said, we probably sold, give or take, probably with 28, 30 cars back then. So that was 77. Pete started the business in 83, 84. We were building cars for those guys. And then in 88, we decided to start Bicknell Race Products. And that was the deal that Pete and Lenny Beauplant had originally started it. And I was a mechanic working for Pete, welding up the cars and building the chassis. And he wanted to keep me on, so he figured he'd get me involved in the company. And that's how we started Bicknell Race Products back then with 3 partners.
Nice. All right. Only about a minute left. We're going to do a part 2 here with Randy, where we're going to go a little bit more towards what he's actually doing today. So is that when things started getting serious? Was the late 80s?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, back then, when you look at it originally, it was always Tobias and then Olson, then Troyer, then Showcar, and on and on and on. And, back then, there was a demand for the sport, especially up our way, because people were going down the States and buying cars from Troyer and that.
They were. Okay.
Yeah. So we felt there was a demand around our area to take care of. And when we first started doing it, we sold a few cars. We weren't crazy busy at first when we started it, but we were busy enough to get going. And then, of course, 88, 89, we got hooked. Well, 89, we got hooked up with Alex Friesen, who got us hooked up with Doug Hoffman in 89. And then it kind of snowballed since then.
We're going to pick up a part 2 here in just a second. And we're going to pick it up right where we left off here in the late 80s when things are really starting to get going for them and other people are driving their stuff. So we'll pick that up here in part 2. I'll have that up day after tomorrow. And we're going to have another Hall of Famer tomorrow and get to meet her. But Randy, appreciate your time, man. Thank you.
Yep. No problem, Doug. Thank you.
Hit the Blue E, guys. Subscribe and get ready. We have part 2 coming up in 2 days.